Well, could you just start for me with a review of your Forest Service career, but begin with telling me a little bit about where you were born and
Okay.
when?
Yeah, well, I was born in Nakusp. And I left home when I was 17 and went to Vancouver. That was 1940, I guess. And I worked there in a saw factory for a short time, then to the shipyards, and then eventually to the Air Force in 1942. So I got on into the air crew program and got my pilot's badge, and I was in the service for 2.5 years. And out again in 45, discharged. And I spent a short time in Vancouver Island working in the bush on a survey. And I always have been interested in the bush, of course, because you know, when you're born in a place like Nakusp, you're there, you're in the woods. And after that little job on the island, I got married, so I had to settle down for a steadier job, and I went into a service station for, I guess I was there for 3 or 4 years, but not much future. So I finished that job out in Creston, and the dispatcher job came open in the Forest Service, so I applied for it and I got it, under Lester Ross. So that job lasted me for the summer, and in those days you didn't know whether you were going to work anymore or not. And you didn't find out until the last day of September whether you were going to go for the winter or not. That's how tight funds were in those days. As it turned out, they told me on the 30th that no, there was no winter work. And very fortunately for me, I had some experience on heavy equipment, earth-moving equipment, prior to going to the forestry. And the Duck Lake Dike program was underway, and they needed an operator. So on the same day they told me there was no work, I was offered a job out there. So I worked all that winter on the Duck Lake Dikes, operating a dragline on the afternoon shift. And I'd had enough of a taste of the forestry by then. I knew that's where I wanted to go. So I spent the winter studying for the assistant ranger exams. I wrote those in spring of 51, February, I guess it was, February or March. And I made the grade, and they offered me a job at Elco, assistant ranger. So that's where I went. And I was there until summer of 53, and they offered to send me to Ranger School, which was the Forest Service Technical School. You're probably familiar with that, at Wally. At that time, it was touted to be the best forestry technical school in the world. Whether it was or not, I don't know, but that's what it was supposed to be. So anyway, I went through that school, 2 terms, and graduated out as a deputy ranger. They had a deputy ranger system in those days. And I came back to work for Buster. That would be in the Christmas of 54. I came back. And I stayed with him until April. And they offered me a ranger's position in Beaverdale. So of course, I took it. And from there to Cranbrook, 11 years. There to Kamloops for 5.5. There to Williams Lake for 7. Back to Invermere for 3.5. Retired there.
When you went to Kamloops, was that as a ranger? Or?
No. I got a promotion to inspector of licensed scalers. So I was with the scaling division for all that time. And my first love, I think, had been the forest protection side of the Forest Service. So when the Caribou was formed, I did on a protection job up there, and I was successful again in getting it. And I spent all my time in the Forest Protection Division up there, doing various jobs. I was in the air tanker program. Actually, I started that when I was in Cranbrook, but I was also involved in it off and on up in Williams Lake. we were also instrumental in forming one of the earlier helicopter attack crews up in Williams Lake. We had a heli attack crew out at Risky Creek, which is a few miles out on the plateau, which worked out very well. I'm not sure if it's still going or not. I think probably it is. Anyway, that's the story. Wage-wise, if you're interested in anything like that, I think I could be wrong on this, but I'll be close. I think I got $125 a month as dispatcher under Buster, and I believe the assistant ranger wage when I went to Elco was $145, and they didn't move you in those days, excepting if you wished and they had a truck available, they would move you. But it wouldn't be a moving van. It would just be a freight truck of some kind. So that's how we moved to Elco. All that furniture piled in the back of an old white truck. You could tell it wasn't a moving van when you took your furniture back off. That's how it was in those days. It was pretty tight going, money-wise. And we really didn't start getting good wages until about 65. And they started to come up within reason.
Was that because of the BCGEU, the unionization? Collective bargaining?
Yes, I think so. I can't remember when the union came in. 65? I don't think the union had come in quite then. No, it hadn't. The union didn't come until the NDP had their first government, which I think was in 72, wasn't it, or 71? But that seemed to be about the time when things started to pick up to where we were starting to get reasonable wages. After that, it was not all that bad. And of course, when I finished out, by 1983 standards, it was quite good. The wages they get nowadays, of course, makes that pale into insignificance. It's the people that worked for me in Invermere are making more money than I was making when I quit by a considerable margin. That's how it goes.
What is it about the Forest Service that attracted you? Why did that look good to you?
Well, as a youth in Nakusp, I had got onto a few fires, just fighting fires. The fellow that was ranger there, his name was Percy Young, and he became the district forester in Nelson later on. As a matter of fact, I worked under him. He was the district forester for most of the years I was in Cranbrook. And I don't know, that kind of appealed to me. And then, of course, I had that time on Vancouver Island on that topographic survey, working for a consulting firm, forestry consulting firm, and it sort of appealed to me. I like the outdoors, of course. Bush I always have. Always liked hunting and fishing. So I really did enjoy my work. No complaints with the Forest Service at all. I enjoyed my career very much.
And you worked with Buster Ross?
I started out under him, yeah.
He was the ranger?
He was the ranger when I started on as dispatcher.
So Jim McDonald had actually retired?
Jim had not retired then. No, he was a ranger supervisor. And he became one of my supervisors when I was in Cranbrook. Yeah, for several years. And Christie, of course, Ollie Christie was one of the others. The main ones were others too, but they were the two main ones. But another thing about the Forest Service, it was a real close-knit family in those days. I don't think it's quite so much now. But in those days, you really got a sense of belonging, and we looked out for each other. It was good.
What knit people together?
Well, I guess it was the Well, in the early going, the common thread were all poor for beginners, but we used to have, every other year, they had a ranger meeting in Nelson. They brought everybody in. And that was a great get-together. We all brought our wives in. And it was usually about a 3-day affair. But, I don't know, it just seemed to be a great bunch of people that were attracted into that type of work. And, with the odd exception, you got along just very, very well. With the odd time you ran into someone that didn't quite suit you, but for the most part, it was really good. A good bunch of people to work with. Just a good philosophy amongst us. I enjoyed it. It was great.
Did every ranger district, or forest district have these meetings?
Yep. Yeah, they did.
Wasn't just Nelson?
No, it was a regular thing. Yeah. There's been a lot of evolution, in the system. When I first started, we had a network of lookout men all over the country. Well, they're practically all gone now. There's hardly any left. There's a few hills that they still man, but it's mostly all aerial survey now. All your fire spotting is done from the air. So that's history in the Forest Service. That used to be part of my job, of course, as dispatcher. Every morning you had a radio schedule with the lookouts, and you had a schedule with them in the evening. You checked in twice a day with them, regular clockwork.
What would the conversation be like?
Well, you would just call them up in the morning and see how things are going, how the weather looked, if they'd had any lightning strikes since the previous evening or anything like that, or what they needed in the way of supplies, so we could plan when to bring them up to them. And the evening one was the same routine, and just double checking everything was okay with them and so forth. And we made regular trips up, of course, with their grocery supplies.
Where did you go from here?
Thompson Mountain. Yeah.
And there's one on the border?
Yeah, we didn't man that one when I was on that job, though.
And McGregor?
McGregor, yeah.
Was that?
I believe McGregor was administered out of Nelson, I think.
So Thompson
was the main lookout, yeah.
Did you talk to them by radio or by telephone?
All by radio. Yeah.
So the telephone was no longer used?
We didn't have a phone up there that I can recall. A lot of them did have the old ground line phones, single wire ground systems. I worked on those quite a bit when I was in Elco. We had phone lines to both the lookouts out there. Mm-hmm. But I don't recall ever having one up to Thompson.
If a lookout saw something during the day, they would report it?
Oh yeah, they just call in any time. As soon as they get it, they would give you the information. Yeah.
So as dispatcher, did you always have to be within earshot of the radio?
Yeah, it was an office job. You had to be there. Yeah, that was one of your jobs, was the radio. Any radio traffic coming from Nelson or from the lookouts or any other district. That was your job. And waiting on the public at the counter. Mm-hmm. And keeping the filing system and even typing as best you could. Of course, we were not typists. We just learned the job. It wasn't, until about the mid-1950s, about the earliest, that you saw any female persons come into the ranger offices as clerks or dispatchers. There just weren't any until about that time. And then gradually it evolved to where all the offices had stenographers, and they also operated the radio. Yeah.
These would be AM radios in those days, the old...
AM radios, yeah, and the FM didn't come on stream until... Boy, I couldn't pin the year down, but I think it would be toward the late 50s, early 60s before we had any FMs.
Were the AM radios more reliable than the telephone?
Yeah, I think so. I think they were. Mind you, we used to keep those phone lines up where we had them. We go over them in the spring right off the bat in the springtime. We'd go out and work on them, put up any that were down, cut any limbs that were infringing on the wire, and so forth. And if it went down, of course you went out, find out why. But the radio was mostly what was used. Yeah. And once we got onto the FM system, we developed an excellent net. That was really good. Really good. And of course that was a tremendous boom to the firefighters when we got the FM systems in, because you had those small portables. Before that, the AM, you had to string up a long aerial, and it was more or less stationary. But with the advent of FM, you had those good portable Motorola's were what we used in the early going, and that was just a tremendous boost to the firefighting organizations. You could have radio contact right within the fire perimeter if you had a big fire, and you always had a good base camp set up to headquarters, so it was great. In the early days, well, that was another job for the dispatcher. If you had a major fire, you always had to have a schedule with the fire camp for their wants and what was going on the fire.
Was that those years that you were dispatcher in Creston, were they particularly busy years? Or?
No, it wasn't particularly. The next year was, in 1951. We had a really busy fire season that year. Mm-hmm. And oddly enough, one of the major fires straddled the Creston Elco boundary. So Buster Ross's crew were on one side of the ridge, and our crews from Elco were on the other. So I had some sort of wrapping back with Buster over that one. His assistant rangers, of course, whom I knew, were on one side, and I was on the other, on the fire camp on the other side.
When you were thinking about the Forest Service, did you think about becoming a professional forester?
Yes, I did. I thought about it. When I was completing the technical school at Wally, that would have been the time for me to do it. And I did think about it fairly seriously. And I talked to the dean about it, and he said, well, you could, but he said, I don't really think it would do you all that much good. But he was wrong. It would have opened the door to more promotion if you'd wanted it. But I didn't do it. In retrospect, I think I would have, because at that time, the professional people they had a program. The BC professional foresters had a program. I think they still do. And they would have written off a lot of the forest protection side of the needs because of the experience we had had. We'd had a lot of hands-on experience there. But we would have had to have written the other side of the picture, all the silvicultural and the pathology and all that. Yeah, I think I would have if I, looking back. Although I really have no complaints. The level of education I had, I did reasonably, I did quite well.
And looking backward from the point at which you made that decision, the role of professional foresters within the Forest Service would have been different than it is today?
Oh, I think so. What has happened here is when the professionals, for the most part, anyway, to get back to your professionals, I think the evolution was, in those early days, they were mostly in the district offices in Nelson, Kamloops, or wherever, and they were spread fairly thin. So they didn't really get directly involved in the workings of the ranger district much. They would be more or less specialists, a lot of them. You'd have your silviculturists and so forth. But what happened over the years, someone in high authority recognized that those foresters should be out in the field more, with hands-on experience. So they started to put professionals out into some of the ranger districts, still under direction of the ranger, but mostly taking care of the management side of it, the the silviculture work and the actual cutting of the timber and the cruising and all that sort of thing. That side of the Forest Service workload was what they mostly did. And then the big major change came when the social credit government decided to reorganize the Forest Service, and they tore down that ranger district structuring, and they amalgamated a lot of ranger districts into big districts. For example, Cranbrook encompasses, 2.5, more than that, 3.5 ranger districts make up that area now, so it's called a district. But when that was first formed, they changed the ranger's role to what they called a district manager, which was, you might say, sort of a super ranger, because it took in a tremendous amount of territory, a lot more territory. And it also gave him a lot more responsibilities and a larger staff than any ranger had ever seen. But I think, and I could be challenged on this, but I think what happened, there were not enough professionals around that had a real good grasp overall of the field, so that they couldn't elevate too many of those people into the district manager's jobs, although they did some. And I don't know exactly what the ratio would be province-wide, but anyway, when they did it, it was a blend of professionals going into those district manager jobs and senior people that were technicians like myself. And that's what happened. So a lot of the senior technicians went into those district manager jobs, and a lot of professionals did too. But now, since I've been retired for 10 years, I don't think you will find very many left of those technicians. It's gradually heading towards the district managers all being professionals. That's the evolution of it. That's what's happening. Yeah.
There's certain qualities of being a forest ranger that certainly wouldn't be part of being a district manager.
A bit different job, all right, because when you were rangering, you spent a lot of time in the field. But when you became a district manager, you didn't have time for that. You got out some, but you were an office person. You became district manager, more or less. You had so many meetings to go to, and you had such a large staff to look after, and you had your specialists under you. So, you didn't get out in the field like the rangers did.
And what about with the public?
Oh yeah, you had to deal with the public a lot. You had to be you did lots of public relation work. Yeah. Interesting. And of course, nowadays, you're probably aware, there's a big uphill fight in forestry in this province. Lots of push-pull going on. And
do you see some of the roots of that in your work with the Forest Service?
Oh yeah, sure. There were mistakes made, there's no question about it. Not a lot of the time, I don't think deliberately made, but there were mistakes made, the application of the cutting practices. We had a few clear cuts that were too big, and a few that were in the wrong place because of erosion and unstable soils and things like that. But by and large, I think it was run quite well. I think the BC Forest Service has really taken a bit more flack from the general public than we should have nowadays. And then, of course, too, that reorganizing was a disruptive thing. And a few years into that, the province was on some tough economic times, and the administration sort of laid off the industry a little bit. And you can't do that. The the Forest Service has to be the watchdog of the industry. It's got to be. And the service was downgraded, and the staffing situation was not good. And that's when a lot of the problems arose, I think. And of course, the industry, to be fair to them, they were in an economic crunch too. But a lot of people just do not understand that. They don't understand that the principle of sustained yield is a good one. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the application of it that's wrong, or has been. But if we really practice the sustained yield as we should be doing it, there's no reason why we couldn't be cropping that forest for a good many years. It's gradually going to go into decline, over time, just because the soil just won't sustain it. It won't sustain producing the same amount of fiber forever. And it's got to go gradually down. But it'll be a long, long time.
There's a certain tension between being the watchdog of industry and serving industry. And in that sense,
yes.
Sure
yes, you've got it's a very difficult situation for the foresters. I mean, they all belong to the same association, and you've got a forester working for the company and a forester working for the Forest Service. So it's not an easy blend in a lot of cases. It's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What were the enforcement issues for you as a ranger?
Well, the rangers, of course, in those days, you had to administer all the cutting of timber in your district. So it was largely a case of policing industry to see that they met the contract conditions. Every outfit that had a timber sale, they had a contract, and very specific things spelled out in that contract as to what they had to do and what they couldn't do. And that was one of the prime jobs of the ranger staff, was to inspect those sales periodically to make sure that everything was as it should be. Great mixture of things. You had in those days there was more, I think, a little more selective cutting than there is now, and you had that part of it to watch for. And of course, you had your slash disposal to worry about. You had any trespassers to worry about, make sure they stayed within the boundaries of their limits.
Was that common?
Not too common. Small trespasses, but nothing major. Major trespasses were not too common. Once in a while, they cropped up, but not often.
Did the terms of the timber sales, did the contract terms change over time, or?
Well, yes, because what happened over time, the industry were allowed to set up their own cutting permits, and in cooperation with the Forest Service. But in the old days, we used to do the whole thing. We used to cruise it, run the boundary lines around it, and set the contract conditions. And then the sale would come up for a competitive bid. Well, nowadays that doesn't happen very much, because most of the timber is it's under a different tenure. It's allocated to the big companies. They know exactly how much annual cut they can have, and they design their own cutting permits with the approval of the Forest Service, of course.
This is
the only competitive blocks you have anymore is with the small business program, where the Forest Service still does set up blocks of timber and they're auctioned off. But the main slice of timber that goes to the large companies, it's not that way. They pay on an appraisal system, whatever there. Each block of timber is appraised at, the stumpage is set. It's not a competitive situation.
Is this when quotas came in?
The quotas now, let me think, when did they come in? Whew.
Well,
the quotas, I think quotas started to come in probably around the early 60s. There was a quota system of sorts then.
How did it develop?
Well, I guess it developed because the industry, of course, would like to have the knowledge that they've got a guarantee of so many cubic meters of wood every year to sustain their operation. And they can build their operation around that figure to stabilize the industry. That's what they wanted. And that's what happened, and it largely did stabilize it, I think. Before that, we had some pretty fierce competition. You know, some of those auction sales would run up to 500 bids. You'd be there half the morning selling one timber sale. They were very, very competitive, and of course, it ran the stumpage up to some pretty astronomical figures, and that in turn would create a greater problem for the ranger staff, because that operator, if he paid a high chunk of dollars for that timber, he was going to try and cut corners, naturally. So I think in order to stabilize the system, the government and the Forest Service saw that they would have to have some kind of a guarantee to the major industry people anyway, you know, so they could develop their plants and work from there. And of course, you know, you get into the situation where you get some massive kill off by insects like they did with the lodgepole pine, and that creates an overcut situation, because there's no point in leaving it there. You might as well harvest it, because if you don't harvest it, it's going to die. And you just have nothing but a sea of snags from one end of the country to the other of dead wood that's of no use to anybody. So that, you know, they had to accelerate the cut to take care of that situation.
Was the objective to develop a normal forest, a forest of equal areas of even-aged classes?
Well, I don't know they could really pin that one down. The main thrust of the whole system was to keep the forest productive, so you had a sustained yield. So in other words, you didn't cut any more than you could grow. And of course that entailed planting, and in some cases spacing.
It also would have entailed knowing what that amount was.
Oh yes.
How did you determine that?
Inventory. We had the whole province was an inventory was taken, and it was upgraded, continuously upgraded.
Is it accurate?
Well, the accuracy fell down, of course, when the economic crunches came, and you got cutbacks on your budgeting, cutbacks on your staff, so you couldn't keep it up to where you should have kept it up. But reasonably accurate, I think so. Reasonably accurate. Certainly not perfect, but. I suspect BC was one of the leaders in the nation in that direction. We were better off than most provinces. But you know, something like a massive insect infestation like that mountain pine beetle, that really plays hob with your cut figures. So it has to be a thing that's over time. You know, you can't balance that cut out within a year. It's got to be over much longer period of time. And of course, the Forest Service, they're losing the land base every which way. You know, you lose it every time a hydro line goes across the country, or a pipeline, or there's a new ski hill, or a golf course development, or whatever. Those are small ones, but the land base is being eroded all the time. There's being less and less of it to produce that wood. But the struggle is we can't seem to make up our minds how much of it we want to set aside for forestry, because there's all kinds of push and pull there. You've got the environmentalists, there's lots of them that they don't want to cut at all. And you've got lots of other legitimate claimers to that land base. You know, you've got agriculture, you've got fish and wildlife. You know, there's all kinds of different people that have a stake in it. So it's a difficult thing to do. You get changes of government, you get changes of philosophy. Ergo, changes of policy.
Have you, over your career, have you seen changes of philosophy? And
not much, because almost all of it was under the social credit government. All but a little bit in '72, and Dave Barrett was in there for a short time.
And what was the difference then?
Oh, not much. They didn't have time to really change much. They were in there for such a short time. No, not much change. But I think now probably there is. I don't know. It looks like it.
So what is that dominant? If it kept a consistent approach throughout that time, how would you characterize it?
What were you saying?
Well, you had started by saying that sometimes there were changes in the approach. I think what you meant was overall forest policy in the province and the way it affected.
Yeah, well, you even got some of those changes with the same government, because you know the governments, even though they're still under that same banner, they do change from election to election somewhat. And of course, the economic situation will cause the government to change its policy somewhat. You know, they backed off quite a bit there when times were tough here a few years back, say about, about 1980. You know, they eased up a little bit on their restrictions because things were tough. The industry was suffering. They were hurting. And of course, nowadays you've got so much of an impact from the environmentalists. They're pushing pretty hard. And a difficult thing for government to decide, you know, how do you allocate that land base? It's difficult. But you know, the rapport between us and Fish and Wildlife it just changed dramatically from the 50s up until say into the 70s. We weren't talking to each other back in those days hardly at all. But
can you explain that a bit?
Well, the Forest Service pretty well had its way on that forest land base in the early years. Fish and Wildlife didn't have too much to say, but over the years we developed a very good working relationship with those guys. Worked very well together, so that the Forest Service started to yield to some of the needs of the Fish and Wildlife people.
What were they?
Preventing streamside damage from logging, things like that, and protecting the critical winter habitat wherever it was. You know, the Forest Service also has to administer grazing in the province. Did you know that?
Why did they resist those in the 50s? What were they?
Well, I don't think they resisted it. It was just that the Fish and Wildlife people were so understaffed. They weren't in a position to really voice their needs that much in those days. That was gradually recognized as being more important and more important, which of course it is. So, you know, in the latter years of my time there, we worked very closely with those guys. Happy, a little happier family stuff. Hello? Numerous little incidents?
It doesn't have to be humorous. I wonder if you have some stories that would characterize the life in the Forest Service. Your first fire, the most frightening fire, something to do with the aircraft, early use of aircraft.
Yeah, well, the early days, of course, the firefighting game was pretty tough because most of it was by hand in those days. The first thing that came on the scene that revolutionized a lot of the firefighting was the power saw. when I was a young fellow over in Nakusp, the fires we went on, there was nothing mechanical. It was all handwork, crosscut saws, sweet saws, and shovels, and Pulaskis, and grub hoes. Everything was by hand. You dug the fire guard by hand. Of course, with the advent of the power saw, that revolutionized that. Part of it helped a lot because you could cut the fire guard right away out pretty quickly with a couple of guys that were knowledgeable with power saws. And then the next thing that came to the fore with the bulldozers. We started to use bulldozers for fire guard construction. Of course, as the years progressed, they became better and better and better machines, and had better equipment to move them and better roads to move them on. And that took a lot of the handwork out of it. And the third major thing on the scene was the helicopters. So the helicopter is just an absolutely invaluable tool when you're fighting a major fire, because for one thing, whoever's directing the fire, you can go up and look it all over in no time with a helicopter. You can fly the perimeter and have a look, see all where the bad spots are and so forth. And for moving equipment, it's just unbelievably valuable to you. And in 1960, we started using air tankers. That was the first year in the Nelson District, I think, that they used any air tankers. Some of them were small ones that had a system of scooping water up in the pontoons and then dropping it. And others had internal tanks. And the first ones that I had anything to do with were the old Mitchell bombers. They were an American military plane, which were converted to dropping.
Twin engine.
Well, we were pretty green. We had a bad fire year in 1960, and we were pretty green when it came to operating air tankers. But they brought in some Mitchells from Washington State up to us at Cranbrook, and we were just dropping either water, and from the water we progressed to mixing it with bentonite. Bentonite is a material they use in the oil drilling business for lubricating the bits. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of a clay, and the structure of it is like a sandwich, and it absorbs a lot of water, take in a lot of water. So we were trying to mix this stuff, and really all we had was muddy water, and we were putting it into these tankers, and away we went. And then somebody came up with the bright idea that detergents break down the surface tension of water, so you'll get more use out of it. Mm-hmm. So we cornered all the triple strength whisk we could find in Alberta and BC. we were loading this stuff into the water, and the system of those old Mitchells was you never shut them down. You filled them up with the motor still ticking over, and the filler was in the top of the tank, and the prop wash took some of that soap and it just blew bubbles right across that airport as far as you could see. But anyway, we were green. We weren't really doing the right thing. This bentonite, in order to get the best out of it, you have to mix it with a beater. And when you do that, we developed our own systems, but it was essentially a gas engine-driven prop in a tank. And you put X number of gallons of water in so many bags of this bentonite, and you beat it up, and it came out sort of like soft ice cream, about that consistency. And we also dyed it. And they had a compound called rhodamin B. It dyed it purple, a bright purple color. But that stuff was so volatile. We started out mixing it with powder. You took the lid off the can, that stuff would go up by itself, and it would just get into everything. Oh, it was the damnedest stuff. It would just get into everything. Your clothes, your shoes, everything would be purple. Anyway, we got around that finally by mixing the rhodamin B with methyl hydrate. And then we had a liquid, so it was more controllable. After that, we were okay, but we sure had some messy-looking guys. So that was another big step, in the fire control of the air tanker program. And as the years went by, it's gotten to be very sophisticated. And of course, we deal with what's the name of the company down in Langley? Started out as Skyways, but it's changed their name now.
Conair.
And they are probably the foremost air tanker company in the world. They go all over the world. And I worked for two summers on the tanker base in Cranbrook, and I was riding the what they call my memory. Anyway, they fly a light plane out.
The bird dog.
Bird dogger, yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. I flew that for a couple of summers too, and I had to look after the tanker base as well as holding down my ranger job. And it was interesting stuff, but it was lots of low-level flying. You were whistling right over the treetops because what you did, you usually checked out the flight path for the tanker first to make sure it was reasonably safe. So we were doing lots of low flying. Oh, we used to drop all kinds of goods out of the Beaver, both free fall and with parachutes. Lots of it. Yeah, I remember one fire I was on. They dropped a crate of eggs with a parachute. They didn't open, and there was a big spruce snag right close to our camp, a few feet away. And that thing came down, and that crate of eggs just slipped down the side of that snag, just as if you had designed it to do that, and the parachute caught on the top, and hit the shroud lines, the crate of eggs came down, and never broke an egg. Unbelievable. On the other side of the coin, they used to dump the bread out free fall. Big cartons of bread. One of those hit a stump. Bread all over the place. And I wonder if some of us didn't get killed from some of those free drops, but we never did. That was an interesting part of the history of the Forest Service too. When you got that beaver in to make a lot of drops, you had to get people spotting where they went down, otherwise you never find them. Quite often you couldn't find them.
I don't quite understand spotting.
Oh, you'd have to have well, let's say your fire was on one side of a valley, and the beaver's going to drop supplies as close to your camp as you can get them. You've got to get somebody on a vantage point to try and spot where those chutes land. Otherwise, you'd never find them. You make a little map and spot where they were, and then you send guys out to retrieve them. And I recall one fire I had away up the St. Mary's River, and in those days you had a commissary system. All the firefighters, if they wanted their daily needs, tobacco, extra socks, shirts, whatever, the ranger had to buy them and send them out. And you had to have a system of keeping track of that so you could get it off his pay. But I had a whole shootload of commissary went west, including a pair of boots, which a loggers' boots don't come cheap. Disappeared. So the ranger's on the hook to absorb that, because the guy never got it. Ranger, you were it. It was out of your pocket. Anyway, getting back to the tankers, that was once we got the system shaken down into something workable and controllable, it's just excellent, because you can have that air tanker out there so fast and dropping on that fire when it's really small. And of course with firefighting, that's the name of the game. You got to get it when it's small, because once it gets to 10,000 acres, your problems just mushroom right out of proportion. You wouldn't believe how tough it is when those fires get large. It's a nightmare. It really is. Anyway, the tankers are great. One little humorous thing that cropped up after I had left the Kootenays, I was up in Williams Lake, or Kamloops, and they drafted me to go to a fire at Williams Lake and do some bird dogging. And we were using cancels, flying boats, and they either could scoop water up off of the nearby lake, or they could go into the airport and load up with retardant. The retardants, of course, were developed beyond the bentonite stage. There's stuff called fire troll now, which is much better. And, it's a pretty good system. Anyway, amongst this crew were two young Americans flying one of those flying boats. They had to have two men in those, a pilot and a co-pilot. And one of the other pilots was an old Canadian veteran, and he was fairly old by tanker pilot standards. And they got arguing one day which nation had the fastest fighter in the war, whether it was the Spitfire or the Mustang. And this old timer, this old Canadian guy, he was getting madder and madder at this young American. And finally he said to him, look, he said, the only time you Americans beat us was coming back from Germany. But the tanker program, it's a great setup, and it's saved us, I'm sure, in many, many major fires.
Why would they be American pilots?
Well, that year we were just strapped. The Con Air was our normal contractor, and they were going flat out. And we brought these cancels in from Alberta, I think, and I guess shortage of pilots, I suppose, I don't know. Well, in the early going, when we were flying the old Avengers, the old single-engine TBMs, they called them, they were a naval aircraft. They flew off the carriers in the war. Most of those guys were American pilots, because those are the ones that had the expertise in operating them. And that, of course, gradually swung around to where most of our pilots now are Canadian. Most of Con Airs are Canadian.
This is a fairly steep country for flying.
Oh yeah, they've had their fair share of accidents. Yeah, people, their planes crashing, hitting a snag or something. Yeah, they have. There was one incident up in Cranbrook where it was the old TBM. He hit a snag with one of the wings, or the tail thing or something. Anyway, it damaged the controls, and he couldn't stop the thing from climbing. It was just gradually climbing. He couldn't control it properly. He bailed out. The plane eventually came down. The chase plane watched it or went. But Con Air lost quite a few of their pilots and machines to crashing. Yeah. It's a dangerous business. There's no question about it. It's dangerous.
What was the job of a bird dog?
Well, primarily you went out right away. As soon as the fire call came in, the bird dog plane was gone. And you'd go out and scout the fire, and it had one Forest Service man on and the contractor's pilot. And you size that fire up and decide which way was best to make the drops, either from a standpoint of the maneuverability of the tanker or the geography of the fire, whichever. You tried to put the guard around it in a triangle shape if you could. Surround the fire with retardant. Sometimes it was real small, just drop it right on it. And some of those guys were amazingly accurate. Just amazing what they could do. They were very, very accurate, some of those pilots. And we always followed it up with the ground crew. But that's the whole idea of it, was to buy time so you get in there and get some people in on the ground. You always had to go. You couldn't just drop the retardant on them and forget them. Couldn't do it. Creep underneath it. Fire would creep underneath, and you might miss a little bit or something. So it was always a follow-up. The program worked well over the years. That's good. What other little things can I tell you that happened over the years? Well, you can't take anything for granted either when you're fighting fires. Not now, but back in the 60s, early 60s, we still recruited people off the street to fight fires. The law of the land was, we could come up to you and say, you're going firefighting tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, here's your blue slip. And you had to go by law. If you didn't, you were in the soup. It's not like that anymore, thank goodness. But anyway, what you were really doing, you were faced with performing a tremendously difficult task with absolutely green people. Completely green. It even got worse, like, say in the 50s, there were a lot of portable sawmills all over the bush. Those guys were knowledgeable. They could run power saws. They knew what fires were about. You had those at your fingertips. But gradually they disappeared as your sawmills became stationary situations in the cities. You didn't have those crews to draw on anymore, so you had to rely on just the ordinary guy off the street. And sometimes you got good ones and sometimes you didn't. So it was a difficult situation. And one humorous little thing that happened, one of my assistant rangers, he was on a major fire, and we were moving bulldozers in early in the morning, and had taken the pickups to the end of the log road as far as they could get them, and the cats were going from there to the fire, which was a couple of miles away. And he'd had a couple of cartons of lunches made up for the bulldozer crews, and he'd gone on up ahead to get the bulldozer started, and he picked out a couple of husky-looking young guys and said, "Go back to my truck," maybe a quarter of a mile back down the cat guard, and bring up a couple of packboard loads of lunches. So away they went. And he saw these guys coming after a bit. They had the packboards on, all right, but there was nothing on them. There was nothing tied on the packboards. And he kept looking. He said, "Well, what the hell's going on here?" Those guys, they didn't know anything about a packboard. And what they did, they pushed the lunches down in between the curved rib and the canvas. So there was maybe 6 or 8 lunches in each packboard. The poor old assistant ranger, he just about went up a tree. But those little things, you know, you take things for granted when you can't. You have to spell everything out exactly. But it's a difficult job. Firefighting. I'll tell you a couple other little stories that are really nothing to do with firefighting, but you're looking for things in the Forest Service. I won't name any names, but up north there was a certain ranger had been after, he had a boat district, he had a large lake in his district, so they had a lot of boat work. Most of their boats were these big river boats and driven with outboard motors. Well, he'd been trying for years and years to get a bigger motor for this boat again. And of course, it's like pulling teeth to get something off the ordinary. So anyway, he finally got this big, huge outboard. Finally came, so he told his troops, "Nobody touches that motor, or I'm going to be the guy to test run that motor." So came the day, one Sunday morning, and they put the outboard onto the river boat. And those old river boats, the control was in the middle of the boat, the joystick type of control for steering. Well, anyway, the motor wasn't running quite nicely to suit him. He was out ripping around the lake, so he went to the back to adjust something, and the rudder must have hit something because the boat took a sudden turn and he went out like a cork. And there was the river boat ripping around at high speed. So he said the third time he came up, the boat was heading straight for shore, and there was a big American launch tied up. And he said that river boat, was going straight for that launch. So he was beginning to wish he hadn't come up. Anyway, he said right at the last second, it veered off, and the RSMP had a long concrete ramp for launching their boats. He said that river boat just went up that concrete ramp as slick as a whistle. Of course, when it hit the top, it broke in half. Anyway, I guess he thought I better report this, so he got it hold of his supervisor Sunday and told him what happened. You know, he was trying to cover that up. I guess he was told to burn the remnants of the boat, get rid of that. Anyhow, I was telling one of my cohorts about this, and he said, yes, he said, I could tell you a similar story. He said, we were taking an inboard engine out of one of our lake boats to send it down to the marine station in Vancouver for overhaul. And he said, we rigged up a tripod with a block and tackle, and we were hauling this motor about. He said, something gave way on the chain mechanism, and the engine went straight down through the bottom of the boat. Smash over. Well, they knew they were in deep trouble. But anyhow, they were supposed to carry on that day and do a cruise on the other side of the lake. So they took the river boat and went over there. And they had it tied up on the shore. They went and did their cruise, and on their way back, they came across an old log chute. In the old days, they used to build chutes out of timber, and they would fire poles down into the water. So they came across this, and I guess there was a part of a pole still sitting in this old chute. They said, gee, it'd be a great thing to see if this thing still works, eh? So they got this pole jarred loose, and they fired it down the chute. When they got down to the lake, it was right through the bottom of their boat. All in one day. So I guess those guys would have a little bit of explaining to do. Oh, little incidents that happened over the years.
They had a boat called the Amabalus on Kootenay Lake. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Yeah, the Amabalus, I can remember them calling it on the radio. I never had anything to do with it. Yeah. But the boat districts are, well, I guess they still have them in some areas, but your helicopters like that are, of course, four-wheel drives. Look where we are with those. In the 50s, we never had many of those either. You were lucky if you had a four-wheel drive in your district. But now all the cisternaires have four-wheel drive vehicles. Practically all of them. It's just about necessary. Oh, I know what I wanted to say to you. And this is getting back to forestry again. We have a lot of, we've done a lot of rapping back and forth across the border with the Americans. The Canadian Institute of Forestry, by example, the Kootenay branch used to have an arrangement with the Montana branch. Would alternate. One year they would come up here and we would take them on a field trip and show them something, and the next year we'd go back down there. So it's a lot of rapping back and forth. I don't know how alone I am in my thinking on this, but I've always felt that over the years we have, as a province, as a Forest Service, we've overemphasized planting trees at the expense of spacing them. We've got thousands and thousands of hectares of forest that there's too many stems. Just like thinning carrots. If you don't thin it, the trees are not going to grow to any great size. So what you go in and you thin that stem, you cut stems out, you space them out, you space the trees out so they can grow better. Well, in my talks with the Americans in Missoula, in Montana, one of those foresters, he worked for a large private company. A little different down in the States. They have large tracts. Some of those companies own large tracts of forest land. It's private land. They own it, but they crop it on a sustained basis. And he said, without exception, if they had a stand that was ripe for spacing, they would get more value out of that than they would ever from planting. You follow me? Mm-hmm. So it's always been a bit of a thing with me that I don't think that we're doing enough spacing in our established stand, because planting is in the public eye. It's a big thing with the public. So it becomes a political thing. Not to say planting's not necessary. Of course it is. We've got to be doing lots of planting, but we've got a lot of what they call not satisfactorily restocked areas from the old days, before we recognized that you had to get in there as soon as you logged, you had to get in there and plant if it was a clear-cut situation. We didn't always do that in the old days, and the consequence of that was, if it didn't get seeded in naturally, which it might not, you might have a couple of off years where there was no seed source, you didn't have a good cone crop, so it didn't get planted, or it didn't get seeded in naturally. What you got was brush. So it got grown in with brush. So to go back in and rehabilitate those areas to plant them is costly. So my argument has been we should not be doing that as long as we've got areas that we could space. makes more economic sense to me to go in and space those stands because you've already got the stems there. They're already there. But we don't seem to do it. We do some, but I don't think we do enough. I think that, if they're looking for work for people to do, man alive, we could be putting our army to work out there spacing to good effect down the road.
Earlier, when you were talking about firefighting, you said that there were many small mills operating in the bush, and that this came to an end.
Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, what sorts of products were they making, and how did they fit into the forest industry? Were they primary sellers, or did they resell to the larger mills? And then the other.
Well, there were two things. Those portable mills, they never had planers attached to them. They were just solid rough lumber, and the rough lumber was hauled out of the bush on a truck. It either went to that portable mill, planer mill, which was stationary in town, or that rough lumber was sold to somebody who didn't have a planer. It was two ways.
And then, what was the change that took place that eliminated them?
Well, I think it was probably the development of logging trucks. As the technology came on stream to make bigger and better logging trucks, it became more economical to haul the logs out of the bush to the stationary mill, where you could really saw a better product, probably less waste. A lot of those portable mills cut ties in those days, supplied the railways with ties. A fair bit of waste with that because you're slabbing, and you also would have had no opportunity to chip that residue. Once you start hauling a log into a stationary mill, you could utilize every single scrap of that log, which we do now, every bit of it. A lot of people, they don't understand the system at all. A lot of people, they get behind a truckload of logs and they see those little tiny logs down to a 4-inch top. They think that guy's cutting young trees. Not so. A lodgepole pine tree, 10 or 12 inches in diameter, is probably mature, fully matured tree. But Forest Service standards, as far as utility goes, were quite stringent. They require them to go right down to a 4-inch top. That has to come out of the bush, otherwise they're penalized. But a lot of people see those little things, they think, gee, look at that, they're cutting all those young trees. Not so. But once you got a better road building equipment too came into the picture, and you could haul large volumes of logs out on those logging trucks into a stationary situation where you much better sawmill, much better chance of utilizing everything. They literally utilize everything nowadays except the sawdust, and in some cases they are even using that now for thermal plants or hydro for electric. So I think that was the natural evolution of things, and of course it was easy for a small entrepreneur to start up a portable mill. You could get into the business without much capital outlay. That was another reason. They were all over the bush everywhere in the 50s. They gradually started to disappear. So now you rarely see them. Hardly any of them.
When you joined the Forest Service, what was the normal prescription for cutting?
In the very early years, a lot of it was diameter limit cutting. You could cut everything 14 inches and up. Diameter, breast high, usually, well, it might have been stump. Probably on the stump. Could be either way. Anyway, there was a diameter control limit on the cutting. That was how a lot of it was done in those days.
Did that mean that those trees were marked to cut, or that the log?
It could be that way. There were different systems. One system was just a straight diameter cut. Let's say you required the stump to be cut no higher than 18 inches. Then whatever diameter that tree would be at that point, that would be your controlling diameter. They couldn't cut anything smaller than that. Mm-hmm. Or you would mark to cut, or you might mark to leave. Depending on the structure of the stand. Some stands you would mark to cut. Others you might go in and mark small groups of trees to ensure a seed source for the next crop, and those would be marked to leave. Or you might a lot of spruce stands in those days that you left blocks. You marked out a block. I don't know, say a couple of chains square. They would have to leave that for seed source. That stayed there. Or it might have been maybe you're in a large stand. You maybe just mark 3 groups of 3. So you ensure a good seed source for the next crop. So it was either way. We did a lot of marking in those days. I don't know whether they do nowadays or not, but we did a lot of tree marking in those days. Painted with paint. You did it with paint, colored paint. One color would be for leave, the other would be for cut.
What caused the change from that system to the current system?
I really couldn't answer that. I'm not sure. Well, perhaps one of the reasons, maybe in the spruce stands, we had a lot of problem with blowdown. Unless you marked out a pretty good sized block of timber, spruce is not a deep-rooted species, and it would blow over. So there was a lot of problem with that. That might have been part of the reason. I don't know. But we were marking small groups at large. We were very, very successful. We had just tremendous regeneration from those sites. No problem at all. I don't know. I guess that different ideas have evolved in the silviculture. Supposedly progressed where it's better. Different ideas. I don't. Maybe they still do some marking. I don't know whether they do or not. Perhaps they do. Don't know. Okay. I've been out of it for 10 years. That's quite a while. Another thing, of course, you're getting pressures from all kinds of sides, and so you have to get into the aesthetics of it. You have to log so it's pleasing to the eye, even, See that clear cut up on the mountain in different color? Mm-hmm. Right on the top?
The two side by side.
Well, now you do what you call landscape logging. You try to log it so it blends into the contour of the geography of the hillside. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't hit you smack in the eye. Now those clear cuts that you see way over there, those are in the same. They just kind of went straight across the top. Whereas that one is sort of curved to meet the round of the hill. And we're doing a lot of that.
That's new.
Well, it was underway 10 years ago. Starting to come in 10 years ago. Even before that a bit. About that time. About 1980 or earlier. It was starting to come on stream pretty good. Yeah. We did quite a bit of that. You know, nowadays you read a lot of criticism of the industry for their big clear cuts, and on top of that, there's also a lot of criticism about their road construction because it causes erosion. And the government is now saying, look, we've got to be a lot tougher on these guys with their road construction. Well, back about, say, the mid-70s, the Forest Service had an excellent engineering division. They were professional engineers, and they oversaw road construction. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the major roads were engineered and built by the Forest Service. That all went down the tube when the austerity program came on. So it was a political decision that wiped that out. So that's what put us back in the soup again, with the industry not being well enough controlled.
Self-policing.
Yeah. Self-policing works fine as long as the economy is buoyant. But when the squeeze gets on, they're going to cut corners, aren't they?
During your term as a forest ranger, this would be...
My time as a ranger was from 55 to 66.
There must have been occasions where you issued stop work orders, where there were trespasses or...
Yeah, the odd time. Yeah, suspensions, because of stream side, falling timber into the streams when they weren't supposed to, or not having their, if it was a part of a mill situation, not having their slab pile fireproof well enough, or a number of infractions, high stumps, whatever, well, not so much high stumps, trespasses, shut them down on that. But yeah, I did issue a few in my time. Not too many, but a few. Most of the people I had to deal with in those years were pretty good to get along with. There weren't too many that I had to suspend. Not too many.
Was the forest industry in the East Kootenays a larger enterprise than over here in the West Kootenays?
Not in those days. Not in the time I was a ranger. No, we had a lot of smaller operators in those days.
Are the two, or were the two at that time different in character?
See what happened. You were talking about the quota system. Now, what happened was that each established outfit at a certain point in time, and I can't tell you when it was, they were given a quota. So much wood was guaranteed to them, in theory, each year. Well, what happened, it was the evolution was that gradually one company would buy out another. So eventually it came down to where there was maybe only one or two major companies owned the whole thing, because when they bought a company out, they also got that quota with it. When they purchased that business, they got the quota. So that's what happened. It was a sort of a natural evolution. So you got away from having the small to medium-sized companies to having huge companies like CFI. You know, they're a pretty big company now. They control most of the wood in the West Kootenay Trench. A lot of it anyway.
So were they starting when you were at Cranbrook?
Yep. Just starting. They were just starting to go.
With the Japanese partners.
Yeah, they really hadn't got rolling real well by the time I left there, but they were in business, starting to go then, yeah.
Tree farm license?
They had a TFL up at Parsons, yeah. That was one of the earlier ones. Yeah.
That would have been very much at the opposite end of the scale of the normal small operator.
Yeah, it's changed completely. Completely changed. Let me think back now. There was 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There was at least 8 small to medium-sized operators when I was in Cranbrook in the earlier days. that had stationary mill situations, and then there was lots of small portables scattered around the bush too. But they gradually bought each other out. So now, I think, as far as I think Cranbrook is the only one that has a mill in Cranbrook, right in town. There could be one other one. I'm not sure. Certainly, they're the only major operator.
Why did they close here?
They closed here. They didn't have enough wood to satisfy the style of mill that was here. It was an old sawmill. They had to have large logs to operate it, and the volume just wasn't there anymore.
Is this area overcut?
The Creston area?
Yeah.
I don't know. I couldn't really answer that. I couldn't tell you.
Well, I'm interested in the development of sustained yield management, and it seems that at the beginning of the timber sale system provided timber to meet industry's need without much reference to long-term planning, and this predates the Forest Service. This right from the turn of the century.
Yeah.
And that by the time the rash of timber staking that occurred around 1905, 1906 was through a great deal of timber had been alienated from the Crown, and most of the accessible timber was reserved by companies. And so from that period until the Sloan Commission in 1945, 46, the timber sale system was a more minor part of the overall harvesting system. But after the war, it really evolved, and I wonder about how you experience that that evolution of the timber sale system as a ranger. What sorts of changes occurred as it became much more the dominant form of tenure in the interior?
Well, I guess the first thing that happened, they set up their public sustained yield units. I couldn't put an exact year on that, but it was quite a long while back. That was the first attempt at it. So, the notion of sustained forestry is fairly old, and from there it evolved into the quota system.
Did the work of setting up the sustained yield units require or change the character of your work at all? Was it a new task and a new responsibility for which you had to be trained, or?
No, not really. I don't think so. Not any major change.
Did people come in from Victoria to do a lot of that work?
Oh yeah, Victoria had people in the field all the time, like your inventory crews are usually forestry based, Victoria based in the early days anyway. Nowadays not so. They've got their own inventory. But I had my own professional forester in charge of inventory in Invermere when I was there. Our problem was lack of funds to do what we should be doing. But yeah, that's true. My memory, I can't tell you exactly when PSYUs came in, but it must have been in the 50s sometime. Anyway, the principle of sustained yields, it's been there for quite a long time. Been administered a little bit different over the years, until it got now to where the industry is self-policing, so to speak.
Successfully?
Oh, yes and no. Some companies excellent, others poor, others lousy. Yeah, not entirely successful. Sometimes, yes. I think CFI are, by and large, pretty darn good corporate citizens. You know, they do a pretty fair job. But there's others that don't. And some of the American companies that came in, I think were fly-by-nights. Louisiana Pacific, one I have in mind. I don't think they did too swift a job.
Over in Salmon.
Cut and get out philosophy, those guys.
Did they come in at a particular time?
I don't know. I don't think so. Not in particular. You know, it's a pity that the Forest Service and the whole industry, they've sort of got a black eye from the public in recent years. And it's too bad in a way, because the principle of sustained yield is a sound one. It's just that it's a difficult thing to administer, and it's tough because you get a lot of interference from the politicians, and it seems to ebb and flow with the economic times.
So how do the politicians interfere?
Well, if times are tough economically, they're going to try and get more revenue out of the forest. And you know, historically, British Columbia has been terrible for plowing back revenue back into the forest. We don't put back near enough as what we've taken out over the years. We've taken an awful lot of money out of the forest over the years and not put much back. Well, if you're going to have a truly sustained yield situation, you've got to do it. You've got to put some money back. Can't take it all out all the time. I don't know. You know, from time to time, there's always been a suggestion that the Forest Service should have been a Crown corporation with a little more autonomy too, but it never has come to pass. Seriously, I don't think. But
that was also a suggestion for Ontario, but it
never happened.
No.
Yeah. I think I don't know for sure. I think Ontario's probably worse off than we are. They're tough shape. I think British Columbia is not that bad. It's not that bad, not that good. Mm-hmm. But
there were remnants of some old sawmilling operations in this area, Canyon and
oh yes, an old. That mill that was here was an old mill. I've been there a long time.
The Creston sawmills.
Yeah.
That was bought or that existed before Cranbrook bought it as a separate company.
Yeah, there were several companies had it before Cranbrook. Mm-hmm. At least two that I know of. Yeah. That was an old mill.
A large lot mill.
Yeah. And you know, the waste that went on in the old days was pretty fierce. When the railway company, when the CP had the railway built, they had 20 miles on each side of the track. They had certain rights to the timber, but they used to cut a lot of their ties up around canal flats. Mm-hmm. You know, they put a portable mill in, and all they cut was ties. And if the log made one tie, fine, but or it'd have to make four. Otherwise, you had huge slabs. Some of those slabs that were left in the bush, they were dry because they'd been there for years. You couldn't pick it up. You couldn't pick up an 8-foot slab by yourself, even though it was dry, bone dry. It was that thick. And it was beautiful wood, clear fir. The waste was just bloody horrendous from those tie operation days. Just awful. You know, I think nowadays you can't question the utility. It's good. I think it's excellent. A lot of people squawk and holler about all the waste that's left in the bush. They don't really know what they're talking about. They go out there and they see a lot of stuff lying on the ground. Sure, there's a lot of stuff lying on the ground, but it's not possible to harvest it these days and make any money on it. So, I think that really our utility is very, very good. I certainly would have no quarrel with it. It's good. Everything's utilized. It goes into that mill now, right down to everything's chipped. Well, a lot of these pulp mills, they exist on sawmill chips. They don't have any chipping operation on at all. They strictly are utilizing chips that are a byproduct of the sawmills that previously went into the burner years ago. So our utilization has come a long way. Probably where we fall down maybe is, I noticed recently in the Maritimes they're in trouble because the Europeans have found some insect in the wood and they're putting the brakes on, and one of their major markets has been rough sawn lumber, going to Europe. Well, that's no good. We've got to do better. I mean, we've got to get it down to where we've got a final product, And I guess we're still shipping logs to Japan, some.
From the coast.
Yeah.
And a lot goes back and forth across the border.
Yeah, an interesting thing I heard about the log shipments to Japan. When I was in the scaling division, one of my cohorts had been a coast scaler. So he was familiar with the scaling on the coast. And that's where a lot of those logs to Japan go from the coast. And two of his buddies had been on a holiday to Japan. Of course, they went right down to the the little sawmilling operations on the waterfronts. And apparently in Japan they have a lot of very small, one or two man operated mills, but they're efficient little mills. They're not poor mills, they're good mills, but they're just small. But he said those guys, the Japanese owners of that little mill, they would come and they would spend maybe 2 or 3 hours picking out one log out of that boom. Look it all over, measure it, remeasure it, check it all over, see where the flaws are in it. They spent hours picking out one log, and then they'd buy that log and get it hauled back to their sawmill because they knew exactly what they were going to cut out of that thing.
Yeah.
Incredible, right?
So there was a real log market with many small buyers.
I guess so.
Logs, yeah.
I suppose.